The sky above the ruined city burned in silent colors, as alien engines tore holes through the clouds, their massive silhouettes blotting out the sun in drifting arcs of metal and light. The people who still lived here had long ago stopped screaming when the invaders came. They watched instead, hollow-eyed, from broken windows and shattered door frames, their fear so deep it had turned into something heavier than terror, something like surrender. The invaders called themselves the Valori, a coalition species that conquered not for resources, but for demonstration. They believed terror was more effective when it was witnessed, when whole civilizations saw what happened to those who resisted. The city below was one such demonstration. Cade Mercer stood alone in the middle of the street, his boots crunching on glass and ash. His armor was scarred, scorched in a dozen places, patched together with field welds and desperation. The rifle in his hands was old, its finish worn down to bare alloy, its energy core flickering with unstable light. Every tactical display in his visor screamed warnings. He was outnumbered, outgunned, cut off from any friendly unit by 3 continents of hostile territory, and an orbital blockade that made evacuation a fantasy. High Command had told him to retreat, to fall back to the last safe extraction zone and preserve what was left of his team. But his team was dead. He had watched them fall one by one in the long-running retreat across burning plains and collapsing cities. There was no one left to preserve. The Valori dropships descended in precise formation, their hulls unfolding like predatory flowers. Warriors spilled out in disciplined lines, towering figures of biometal and pulsing light, their weapons humming with lethal resonance. They advanced slowly, deliberately, because they had learned that humans ran when faced with inevitability. The Valori commander stepped forward, its elongated skull crowned with sensor crests that flickered with alien data. Its voice boomed across the street, translated by Cade's visor into harsh, mechanical English. "You are the last. Lay down your weapon. Your death will be recorded and broadcast. Your species will learn." Cade laughed, a short, broken sound that surprised even him. His throat was raw from smoke and shouting, his body running on chemical stimulants and stubborn will. He raised his rifle, not aiming at the commander, but at the nearest dropship. "You guys really love your audience," he said quietly, mostly to himself. The Valori commander tilted its head, a gesture that might have been curiosity. "Reinforcements are inbound," it continued, gesturing to the sky. "Your resistance will be brief." Cade shook his head. He didn't look up at the ships. He looked past them, at the buildings where frightened faces watched from the shadows. He thought of the refugees he had helped evacuate weeks ago, the children who had clung to his armor, the old man who had pressed a battered locket into his hand for luck. He thought of the worlds the Valori had already crushed, the broadcasts of burning capitals and kneeling survivors. He thumbed the rifle's selector to overload and smiled. "I don't need reinforcements," he said. The Valori commander's sensors flared, detecting the rising energy spike. "Then what do you need, human?" Cade stepped forward, boots splashing through a shallow puddle of oil and rainwater. He raised his voice so the people in the ruins could hear him, so the cameras on the dropships could capture every word. "I need witnesses." He fired. The rifle's shot was a concentrated spear of unstable plasma that slammed into the dropship's forward engine housing. The impact detonated the volatile fuel cells inside, turning the massive craft into a blossoming fireball that ripped the sky open with light and thunder. Shards of molten metal rained down, scattering the Valori formation in reflexive disarray. Cade didn't wait for the smoke to clear. He sprinted forward, firing again and again. Each shot aimed not at soldiers, but at symbols, banners, sensor towers, command nodes. The street became a storm of energy and debris. Valori warriors returned fire, beams carving trenches in the pavement, slicing chunks from buildings that collapsed in roaring cascades. Cade weaved through the chaos, his visor darkening to compensate for the glare, his armor screaming as impacts hammered against its failing shields. Pain flared down his left side as a glancing hit burned through plating and scorched flesh, but he kept moving. The Valori commander barked orders, its troops reforming with mechanical precision. Drones launched from the dropships, sleek shapes that darted through the air, their targeting arrays locking onto the lone human. Cade ducked behind the husk of a transport truck as beams tore through the space he had just occupied. He ripped a charge from his belt, thumbed it live, and hurled it into the swarm. The explosion shredded 3 drones and sent the rest spiraling off in damaged arcs. He pushed up from cover and advanced again, his world narrowed to targets and timing. Above, the remaining dropships adjusted formation, weapons ports opening to bring heavier fire to bear. The Valori commander's voice cut through the din, amplified and cold. You will be erased. Your defiance will serve as proof of our supremacy. Cade grinned behind his visor, blood trickling into his mouth. Then make sure you get my good side. He triggered the last of his heavy munitions, a jury-rigged rocket he had salvaged from a destroyed emplacement days earlier. The rocket streaked upward and slammed into a dropship's underside, punching through armor and detonating inside. The ship lurched, then began to fall, its descent a slow, terrible arc toward the city. The Valori troops faltered, their perfect formation breaking as the burning craft crashed into the outskirts with a concussive roar that shook the ground beneath Cade's feet. Shockwaves rippled through the street, knocking warriors off balance and shattering already fragile structures. The people in the ruins screamed then, not in fear, but in something raw and unfamiliar that bordered on hope. Cade heard it, and it fueled him more than any stimulant. He charged into the disordered ranks, firing point blank, moving too close for the Valori to bring their heavier weapons to bear without risking their own. His rifle overheated, vents glowing white hot, and he tossed it aside when the core finally cracked with a shriek of metal. He drew his sidearm and kept going. A Valori warrior lunged at him with a blade of coherent light. Cade caught the haft on his armored forearm, the impact numbing his hand, and slammed his helmet into the creature's face. Biometal crumpled, alien fluid spraying in a hiss of vapor. He tore the blade free and drove it into another warrior's chest, feeling the vibration of energy through his bones as the weapon discharged. His armor's power reserves dipped into the red. His breath came in ragged gasps. The Valori commander retreated a step, its confidence faltering as it processed the unfolding chaos. This was not how demonstrations were supposed to go. The human was not dying on schedule. He was dismantling the spectacle. Cade turned toward the commander, lifting the stolen blade. He was bleeding from 6 wounds now, his movements slowing, but his eyes burned with a fierce, almost joyful light. You wanted a broadcast, he said. Make sure they see this. The commander raised its weapon, its sensors locking onto Cade's chest. Simultaneously, orbital fire lanced down from the sky, a pillar of annihilating energy aimed at the street to end the anomaly of resistance. Cade saw the light bloom above him and knew this was the end of his run. He planted his feet anyway, squaring his shoulders, lifting the blade in defiance. The beam struck, swallowing the street in white fire. The last thing the Valori cameras recorded before the feed cut to static was a lone human silhouette standing unbowed in the heart of destruction, a figure too small to matter and too stubborn to erase. The blast that should have erased Cade Mercer did not end the story the Valori wanted to tell. When the orbital beam tore the street into molten ruin, their sensors recorded the impact. The vaporization curve, the thermal bloom expanding in perfect lethal symmetry. The feed cut to static, and across 100 conquered worlds, the broadcast looped the final image of the lone human silhouette standing against the light. The Vailori commanders expected terror to follow, the familiar collapse of morale that came when a species saw its champions reduced to ash. Instead, something else happened. On scattered colony worlds, humans who had already been herded into camps watched the broadcast on contraband receivers. They did not see defeat. They saw defiance frozen in a frame of white fire. They replayed it, frame by frame, burning the image into memory. The Vailori archives flagged the anomaly as a statistical outlier, an emotional spike that did not match projected surrender curves. Analysts adjusted their models. The occupation continued. In the ruins of the city, beneath meters of vitrified stone and collapsed steel, something stirred. The beam had liquefied the street, but the underground transit tunnels had partially absorbed the force, channeling the energy in unpredictable ways. Cade Mercer did not wake to light. He woke to darkness and the distant drip of water echoing through broken concrete. Pain came first, a tidal wave that threatened to pull him under again. His armor was fused to his body in places. Power cells dead, emergency systems running on their last redundant circuits. He coughed, and the sound was small in the vast hollow beneath the city. The beam had not killed him outright. The stolen Vailori blade had absorbed a fraction of the initial impact, its energy field collapsing in a burst that deflected the core of the strike, just enough for the rest to be scattered by the surrounding structures. It had been luck, layered on stubbornness, layered on physics, the Vailori had not bothered to model for a single, expendable human. Cade lay still, forcing himself to breathe, to take inventory of pain, without letting it take inventory of him. His left leg was pinned beneath a slab of collapsed ceiling. His right arm trembled with nerve damage. His visor was cracked, HUD flickering in and out with ghosted warnings. He tried to move, and black spots swam across his vision. He laughed weakly at the absurdity of it. Witnesses, he had said. He had wanted them to see. Now the universe had decided he should see what came next. Above him, the city burned in slow, dying fires. Vailori patrols moved through the ruins, securing the impact zone, collecting data and bodies, restoring the narrative of inevitable dominance. Their drones skimmed over the glassed street, sampling residue, confirming the kill with cold certainty. The commander filed its report with a note of irritation at the broadcast disruption caused by the static cutoff. The demonstration would be repeated elsewhere. They did not dig deep. They did not imagine the human silhouette could have fallen into the bones of the city and lived. In the tunnels, time stretched thin. Cade drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind snagging on fragments of memory, on the faces of his team, on the sound of the refugees' voices. When he came back to himself, there was light ahead, faint and wavering, and the scrape of metal on stone. A small figure picked its way through the rubble, dragging a jury-rigged sled made from scavenged door panels. The figure froze when Cade coughed. For a long moment, neither moved. Then the figure whispered, "Human." The word was reverent, disbelieving. A young woman stepped closer, her face streaked with soot, her eyes too old for her years. She wore the patchwork gear of the resistance cells that survived in the cracks of occupation, the ones the Vailori considered irrelevant. She had been sent to scavenge tech from the impact site, to strip what she could before patrols returned. She had not expected to find a ghost. She dropped to her knees beside Cade, hands hovering as if afraid to touch him. "They showed you die," she said, her voice shaking. "They showed everyone." Cade managed a grin that hurt his split lip. "Guess the show got edited." The woman laughed, a sharp, wet sound that turned into a sob. She pressed the canteen to his mouth, careful not to jostle him. Water tasted like life. She called the help into a cracked combead, her words tumbling over each other in a rush of disbelief and urgency. Others came, moving quietly, faces lit by hope and fear in equal measure. They worked with practiced efficiency, bracing the slab, easing Cade's leg free, whispering reassurances like a litany. Each touch grounded him, pulled him back from the edge. They hauled him onto the sled and began the slow journey through the tunnels, away from the glassed street and the Veilori sensors. Above them, the occupation tightened its grip. Across the stars, the broadcast looped. The Veilori did not notice the shift at first. They tracked compliance metrics, not stories. But stories moved faster than fleets. In labor camps on distant moons, humans whispered about the man who had stood against the sky and lived. In hidden channels, the final frame of the broadcast became an icon, overlaid with crude symbols of defiance, passed from device to device. Other species under Veilori control watched too. They had seen countless demonstrations of supremacy. They had never seen one interrupted by a single figure who refused to play his part. The image unsettled something old in them, something they had buried under generations of submission. In a fortified command spire orbiting a conquered world, a junior analyst flagged a rising pattern of unauthorized data exchange and anomalous morale readings among human populations. The Veilori command dismissed it as noise. The coalition had crushed rebellions before. They did not fear symbols. They were a civilization of weapons and certainty. They did not understand that certainty could crack when a witness realized the story was not complete. In the tunnels, Cade drifted again, feverish, his body fighting to knit what had been torn. He dreamed of light that did not burn, of standing on a ridge watching dawn break over a free city. He dreamed of his team, not as they had fallen, but as they had laughed in the quiet moments between fights. When he woke, he was in a cavern lit by scavenged lamps, surrounded by people who looked at him as if he was something fragile and impossible. The woman who had found him sat nearby, cleaning blood from his armor with gentle, methodical strokes. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lyra," she said. "You're going to be a problem for them, you know." Cade closed his eyes, a tired smile tugging at his mouth. "Yeah," he said. That was kind of the point. The Veilori response to the spreading anomaly was methodical and brutal. They increased patrol density, flooded occupied cities with additional surveillance drones, and imposed harsher collective punishments whenever resistance cells were suspected. Entire districts were darkened, populations relocated, demonstrations staged with renewed theatrical cruelty. The coalition believed pressure would collapse the story humans were telling themselves. The pain would reassert the proper narrative of inevitability. But pain had already become the common language of the conquered, and its escalation did not silence the whispers. It sharpened them. In the cavern network beneath the ruined city, Cade Mercer became both patient and symbol. He lay on a scavenged med table, while Lyra and others tended his wounds with tools salvaged from broken medkits, and Veilori biotech scavenged at great risk. The alien components reacted unpredictably with human physiology, but necessity forced experimentation. Every breath Cade took was an act of stubborn biology, pushing back against precision-engineered annihilation. Word of his survival rippled through resistance channels like an electrical surge. Cells that had operated in isolation for fear of detection began to risk contact, trading information, pooling resources, coordinating small acts of sabotage that felt suddenly meaningful. A single survivor had shifted the math of hope, not because he was a superweapon, but because he had been seen refusing to vanish. The Veilori did not understand this calculus. Their doctrine measured deterrence in destroyed assets and televised terror. They did not model the way a story could infect a population more thoroughly than any pathogen. When patrols failed to intercept data bursts and resistance strikes multiplied in minor but irritating ways, Veilori Command authorized targeted purges. In the city above the tunnels, entire neighborhoods were sealed and cleared. Their inhabitants marched into transit vessels, bound for off-world labor camps. The broadcasts resumed, crisp and merciless. The coalition needed to reassert control of the narrative. In the cavern, Cade listened to reports filtered through cracked comms and felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle onto his chest, heavier than any slab of concrete. He had not asked to become an icon. He had wanted witnesses, not worship. The difference mattered to him. But to people living under occupation, any crack in the myth of invincibility was oxygen. Lyra argued with him when he tried to sit up before his leg had fully mended. "You don't get to go back out there yet," she said, pressing him down with a firmness that brooked no nonsense. "You standing in that light once was enough to light fires. You don't have to burn again to keep them going." Cade stared at the cavern ceiling, at the web of cables and stalactites that glistened with condensation. "Fires go out," he said. "They need tending." The resistance leaders debated what to do with him. Some wanted to move him off-world through dangerous smuggling routes to preserve the symbol. Others wanted to use his presence to rally cells into coordinated strikes that could disrupt Valori logistics in meaningful ways. Cade listened, weighing the options with the tired clarity of someone who had already died once and found himself still breathing. He knew the Valori would hunt the anomaly relentlessly. He also knew hiding indefinitely would turn the story stale. Witnesses needed new chapters. The decision was made in fragments, in late-night murmurs and hard stares. Cade would not lead from the front while he healed, but his voice would travel. They recorded him telling the truth of the glassed street, of fear and pain, and the moment he had chosen defiance over survival. They spliced the message into resistance broadcasts, piggybacking on Valori channels whenever possible. The coalition's sensors chased the signal, but it slipped through the cracks, appearing for seconds on screens in camps and factories before being cut. Those seconds were enough. The message was not grand. It did not promise victory. It did not ask for sacrifice. It asked for witnessing. "See what they do," Cade said in the recording. "See it clearly. Don't let them decide what the story means." The Valori Analyst Corps noticed a new pattern. Demonstrations of force were being reframed by occupied populations in unauthorized ways. Footage intended to induce terror was being archived, annotated, shared with commentary that stripped it of its intended authority. The coalition responded by restricting broadcasts, reducing the visibility of their own demonstrations. This, too, was a mistake. The absence of spectacle created space for rumor, and rumor carried the human silhouette further than any official feed had. On a mining world light years away, a non-human laborer watched a fragment of the static interrupted broadcast and felt something stir that had not moved in generations. If a single human could stand against the sky, perhaps the sky was not as immutable as it seemed. In the cavern, Cade finally stood on his own, weight tentative on his mended leg. The pain was sharp, honest, grounding. He looked at the faces around him, at the mix of fear and resolve, and felt the old familiar pull toward the front lines. He raised a hand before anyone could argue. "I'm not going back to be a martyr," he said. "I'm going back to make sure they keep seeing us as we are. Not as footage, not as props in their show. As people who don't agree to disappear." The cavern was quiet, the weight of the choice settling over them. Then Lyra nodded. "We'll make sure they're watching," she said. The Valori learned to fear silence. Not the absence of noise, but the absence of reaction. Their demonstrations had always relied on predictable responses, on terror rippling through populations in measurable waves. Now, when their patrols burned a resistance cache or executed suspected saboteurs, the expected compliance spikes did not follow. Instead, there were pockets of stillness, moments where crowds watched without flinching, eyes lifted not in surrender, but in something closer to appraisal. The coalition's commanders began to notice the way occupied populations looked at them, as if the story being told had shifted, and the invaders were no longer the authors. In the ruins and tunnels of the city, resistance cells grew bolder, coordinated by whispered routes and fleeting signals that danced just ahead of Valori interception. Cade Mercer moved with them again, slower than before, but with a new caution that came from knowing he had already paid for one reckless stand, with his life nearly spent. He wore patched armor stripped of identifying markers, his silhouette less iconic, his presence more deliberate. He did not seek the light now. He sought angles, vantage points where Valori actions could be seen clearly by those they wanted to cow. The resistance learned to stage their own kind of theater, not of destruction, but of exposure. When Valori youths swept a district, hidden cameras captured the precision of their cruelty, the way they separated families, the mechanical efficiency with which they erased dissent. These feeds were pushed into the cracks of occupied networks, not with commentary, but with simple timestamps and coordinates. Witnesses did the rest. The coalition's analysts flagged the trend as narrative contamination. They attempted to counter it with controlled benevolence, staging distributions of supplies and selective mercy to rehabilitate their image. The effect was uneven. In some sectors, hunger softened resistance, long enough for the spectacle of aid to land. In others, the gesture backfired, read as manipulation layered atop brutality. The Valori had never needed to persuade before. They had only needed to demonstrate. Now persuasion was becoming part of the battlefield, and it was not a terrain they understood. Cade felt the shift in the way people moved around him. He was no longer just a rumor, or a relic of a single moment. He was proof that the invaders could be interrupted, that the narrative could be hijacked mid-broadcast. That kind of proof drew danger like a magnet. Valori hunter-killer units began to appear in the sectors where resistance activity spiked, their algorithms tuned to patterns of disruption rather than heat signatures alone. Cade and Lyra barely evaded one such unit in the shell of an old transit hub, slipping through maintenance shafts as coherent light scorched the walls behind them. They ran until their lungs burned, until the only sound was their own breath and the distant hum of alien engines, fading into the maze of the city. In the darkness, Lyra laughed, a thin, breathless sound edged with adrenaline. "They're learning," she said. Cade nodded, pressing his back to the cold metal wall. "So are we." The resistance adapted faster than the coalition anticipated. They stopped clustering, stopped building anything that could be called a base. Cells became fluid, overlapping in function but isolated in knowledge, sharing only what was necessary through human couriers who moved in the blind spots of Valori surveillance. The coalition's reliance on network data became a vulnerability when the network itself could be polluted with uncertainty. False positives bloomed in their threat matrices, drawing resources to empty ruins, while real operations slipped through the gaps. The Valori Command Spire issued new doctrine updates, tightening control, increasing the severity of reprisals. The result was a grim symmetry. The harsher the occupation became, the clearer its cruelty was to witnesses. The clearer the cruelty, the less the spectacle worked as intended. On a broadcast intercepted from a distant world, Cade watched as a Valori commander announced a demonstration meant to reassert dominance over a newly restive population. The camera lingered on the bound figures, on the precise alignment of weapons. Cade turned away before the order was given. He did not need to see the end to know the shape of the beginning. He focused instead on the map Lyra had projected onto the cracked wall, on the routes that could get witnesses into position before the Valori sealed the district. If they could not stop the demonstration, they could at least make sure it was seen for what it was. They moved under cover of smoke and shadow, slipping through alleys that still smelled of old fires, emerging into vantage points that overlooked the square where the Valori had assembled their spectacle. Hidden lenses blinked to life, capturing every angle. Cade felt the familiar tightness in his chest as he watched the crowd forced into formation, the way fear bent spines even when eyes burned with hate. He wanted to run into the open again, to draw the light to himself and away from the bound figures. He stayed where he was. Witnesses, he reminded himself. The execution was swift, efficient, meant to be merciful by Valori standards. The feeds went out seconds later, seeded into occupied networks before censors could clamp down. The reaction was not what the coalition had modeled. There was no surge of compliance. There was a surge of documentation. Screens filled with still frames, with slow-motion replays, with the quiet, damning persistence of watching. The Valori began to restrict their own broadcasts further. But the absence of spectacle only intensified the underground circulation of what had already been seen. Cade and Lyra withdrew as patrols converged on the square, slipping back into the city's veins. In the aftermath, small acts of defiance flared across multiple sectors, not coordinated by command, but sparked by the shared witnessing of cruelty, stripped of its intended authority. The coalition's grip tightened, then slipped not in any dramatic collapse, but in a series of small failures of narrative control that added up to something the Valori had never faced before, an occupation that could not control how it was seen. The Valori coalition finally understood that they were no longer fighting an army. They were fighting perception. Their fleets still ruled the skies, their weapons still erased cities with clinical efficiency, but the meaning of those acts was slipping from their grasp. Where once a burning district had been a warning, now it was evidence. Where once a public execution had been a lesson, now it was an indictment. The coalition's command algorithms began to fracture under contradictory inputs. Models predicting submission, colliding with data showing defiance, spreading in quiet, persistent ways. This dissonance did not slow their campaigns, but it hollowed their certainty. In the occupied city, Cade Mercer felt the shift like a change in weather. Patrol routes altered, not just to catch resistance, but to avoid being seen. Demonstrations of force grew rarer, replaced by sealed operations conducted out of public view. It was a small victory, fragile and incomplete, but it mattered. Tyranny that had to avert its eyes had already conceded something to those who watched. The resistance adjusted again, not chasing spectacle, but drawing it into the light when it tried to disappear. They seeded listening devices into Valori command nodes, intercepted fragments of planning data, and leaked the existence of hidden purges to occupied networks. Witnessing became proactive, a way of forcing the coalition back into the open. Cade moved through this shifting landscape as a conduit more than a commander, connecting cells, carrying stories, reminding people that what they saw mattered, even when it hurt to look. The image of the human silhouette in white fire faded from prominence as new images took its place. A family shielding each other in the glare of alien lights. A line of workers standing still as drones circled. A single unarmed figure stepping into a patrol's path to buy time for others to flee. None of these acts won battles. They won something harder to quantify. Across the stars, the Valori faced a new problem. Non-human populations under their control began to mirror the human behavior of watching and documenting, of refusing to let demonstrations define the narrative alone. The coalition's myth of inevitable supremacy depended on isolation, on each conquered world believing it was alone in its suffering. The flow of witnessing broke that isolation. A mining guild on a distant moon staged a work stoppage, timed to coincide with leaked footage of a hidden purge. A transport crew diverted a shipment of Valori materiel after seeing the faces of those executed in a city they had never visited. These were small fractures, but fractures propagate. Valori command convened to reassess doctrine. Some argued for overwhelming annihilation, to restore fear at any cost. Others cautioned that total destruction would only feed the narrative contagion they could no longer fully contain. For the first time in their recorded history, the coalition debated restraint not as a moral concept, but as a strategic necessity. In the ruins of the city, Cade stood on a rooftop at dawn, the sky a bruised gradient of smoke and pale light. Lyra joined him, offering a piece of ration bread that tasted like dust and survival. "You ever think about what happens if this works?" she asked. "If they really do start to pull back?" Cade watched a Valori patrol pass below, their formation tight, their weapons lowered but ready. "Works is a big word," he said. "I think about what happens if they can't control the story anymore, if every act they take has to survive being seen." Lyra nodded, her gaze following the patrol until it vanished into the maze of streets. "That sounds like the beginning of the end," she said. Cade shook his head, a small smile touching his mouth. "Sounds like the beginning of accountability." The resistance did not topple the Valori overnight. There was no final broadcast where fleets burned and chains fell away in a single glorious cascade. What changed was slower, and in its way more dangerous to an empire built on spectacle. The coalition found that every act of terror created witnesses who would not forget, that every attempt to hide created suspicion, that every effort to reassert narrative control drew more eyes to the places they most wanted unseen. Over time, the cost of occupation rose not in lost ships, but in lost certainty. The Valori could still conquer worlds. They could no longer conquer how those worlds understood what was being done to them. In the end, that understanding proved contagious. Cade Mercer faded into the network of people who watched and remembered. His name less important than the habit he had helped ignite. He did not stand in the light again. He stood in the places where light was denied, and made sure someone was there to see.